Hey there, Sean McGeever here. I'm here with Ewan, our dog. Shout out to my friend Ewan in Scotland, of whom he's named after. One of the Talk Tuesdays, my friend Judy Wilson said that her favorite part, actually the only part that she watched, was when Ewan was in it. So I thought I'd start. Since the last Talk Tuesday ever. So yeah, he wants to go anyway. All right, see you, buddy. Oh, bye, Ewan. Okay, you gonna stay here and listen? Okay. Anyway, well, I'm gonna get started. Like I said, we're doing a Talk Tuesday, and I'm Sean McGeever. I'm going to walk through how to do a club talk through Mark chapter 16, and this actually happens to be the last one of all four Gospels. So, yeah, I'm excited to do this, and actually, as it turns out, I'm doing this talk in my club here at Pinnacle, Go Pinnacle, on Monday. So, yeah, it's really fitting that I'm going to do that. So if you look at Mark chapter 16, you'll notice that it is about the resurrection. And there's a little bit of I'll explain some of the technicalities of it in a moment. But I would like to say that, even though this is the last chapter of Mark's gospel, it's not the last part of the gospel. In Young Life, often we kind of fail people, I think, by really emphasizing the cross, and it's kind of the end of the story. In this case, we do have the resurrection. I feel like a lot of resurrection talks, to be honest, are cut really short. They're really rushed. People don't really understand the significance of it. The cross is kind of like the focal point. And I actually think that sets us up to shortchange a bit of the gospel, especially when it comes to discipleship. Kind of like, what's next? Why would I live? If it's merely just the transaction that happened in what theologians call the atonement, which of course is so important, then we miss out on really what Jesus had in mind, which was to resurrect from the dead, not only to show that he has conquered death and everything that we learn in 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, if you do a resurrection talk, be sure to read all of 1 Corinthians 15 to get the theology behind it that Paul spells out. But there's even more past that. There's not only the resurrection, but there's Jesus' ascension into heaven. Jesus went into heaven and said, it's better that if I go away, because if I go away, then the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, the Counselor, will come alongside you. We learned that in John. And so then we have Pentecost, and then we actually see the genuine change inside of the disciples' life and the disciples' lives. And in fact, if you look at Matthew 28, where the Great Commission is, Jesus certainly is resurrected, wonderful, but the disciples are still doubting, and they're not believing. Just read right before, not starting in 19, read verse 16 and 17. Long story short, the gospel is massive and huge, and I don't hear a lot of Young Life talks going on and talking about the ascension, the gift of the Spirit, what it means to follow Christ. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we are working so hard to go deeper in our mission, which is great. But we need to go beyond the cross, because the gospel writers do. We need to go include the resurrection and the ascension and the gift of the Spirit, because that's really where the power starts to be able to grow in your faith, grow. Anyway, there's a little introduction. I do want to talk briefly about Mark's gospel. There is a bit of a technicality there. As N.T. Wright puts it in one of his commentaries, he says, Mark's ending is missing. And so if you have any decent Bible, it will have a little line or a footnote or something like that, brackets, after verse 8, and it will say something along the lines that the earliest manuscripts do not include this portion. I've done my research. I'm a bit of a Bible scholar, teach theology, all that, PhD. So I agree. Stop at verse 8. Don't read on and talk about the things after that. That's not a part of Mark's gospel. We can get all of that from the other gospels. There's plenty there, but there's also some wonky things in the end there. And actually, I think it's neat, since we're focused on Mark, I would just leave it with that. The reason why scholars leave it is, or people think, well, why it must have been cut off. People like N.T. Wright, virtually every New Testament scholar would say, well, it ends really oddly. It says that the women are afraid, and we don't actually encounter the risen Jesus. We do know that the person in the tomb says that he's risen, so we do have the resurrection, but we don't have the proof. We don't have all the other things that we have in the other Gospels, and so, and even the way that the wording is, in the Greek and all that, it just wouldn't end like that. So I won't go into the technicalities of it, but Mark ends in verse 8. If you're going to just, stay disciplined to Mark chapter 16, also end your talk there. What Mark is interested in is the simple facts. And so I would encourage you to just explain the simple facts in these 8 verses. 1, the women go to the tomb. That's the first 3 verses. Second, the women see the stone rolled back and that there's an angel inside. That's the next 2 verses. Third, and this is where I would focus in, what is it that the angel says? This is all kind of wrapped up in just 2 verses, but I think this is where I would focus here. The angel says 3 things. 1, that Jesus is risen from the dead. 2, come see for yourselves. And 3, tell others. I mean, that's where the heart of this message is. This is where the gold of the resurrection talk is. 1, Jesus is risen. 2, see for yourselves. So this idea, we want you to see. What have you seen here at Young Life? What have you seen about Jesus? What have you seen, and what do you see in this talk here? And then 3, tell others. So, the angel is telling the woman to tell others, but kind of like respond, if you will. And so I would that third part about the angel, the things that the angels say, that's where I'm going to focus my talk. And then the fourth part, just of these 8 verses, is that the women are flooded with emotions. They're trembling, they're in astonishment, they're in fear, and that's normal. Actually, I think if we were to really understand what's Jesus is really alive, he's truly God, it's okay if it's emotional, overwhelming, scary, all that. So, Mark doesn't provide a detailed theology or conclusion. He just kind of lays out the text as it is. And I think that there's plenty there for us to do that as well. So my emphasis is going to be on that Jesus is risen. What have you seen about Jesus in Young Life ever or anywhere, but also tonight, and how are you going to respond? Really easy. So a main point, have you seen for yourself if Jesus is God, and will you respond to make him the ruler, the king of your life? Another possible main point, what do you think happens after you die? And what we learn from this passage is that death is not the end for Jesus, and it's not the end for us. Another possible main point is for us to not rush through Jesus' suffering for 3 days in the tomb. And so you don't have to go there, but I think it is significant that, you have Jesus dying on the cross on Friday, and then we don't have Jesus rising until Sunday. It makes sense. There's a Sabbath in between there, so they wouldn't have, there's a lot theologically going on there. But, Jesus didn't die on a cross and say, it is finished, take his last breath, and then, die, and okay, he's dead, and then boom, just pops right back up. No, it actually takes 3 days, and I think that is significant for those of us who are suffering. And certainly if you haven't, or I'm sure you have to a certain extent, people that you'll be speaking to, some of them are coming into your club with a lot of difficulty, challenges, and suffering. So you could highlight that often suffering happens in slow motion, and that Jesus' resurrection from the dead didn't happen instantly. It took a little bit of time. What does this show us about Jesus? Well, Jesus is God. Only God could conquer death. Only the creator of life could conquer something like death. What else does this show us? Jesus didn't resurrect immediately, but in our suffering often actually doesn't get better overnight. You could come to Jesus. You could become a Christian, and that doesn't mean that things are just going to get fixed instantly. What does this have to do with our lives? If Jesus did rose from the dead, we know what happens after death. We have a preview of it when we look at the resurrection. And so what does this have to do with our life? We know that there's more. There's more to life. There's more time, and it kind of begs the question: what's your response to Jesus? How do you want to respond to his offer of eternal life, to be with him in heaven, and for that to be a part of your present right now? And one other thing, was this have to do with our lives? I think that actually the gap, the delay in time between Friday and Sunday, shows us that Jesus isn't always fixated with fixing our problems immediately. It might be that our challenges remain after following Jesus. A couple technical details, and then I'll give you a couple suggestions on illustrations, and then I'll be done. The Sabbath, in verse 1, it talks about that the Sabbath was past. The Jewish, women were Jewish, and they weren't allowed to work, quote unquote, on the Sabbath. We know that from all the gospel stories and from the Old Testament, of course. And so this was literally the very first opportunity that the women could have went to the tomb and do the things that they're going to do. That would have been considered work. And so this is when it says when the Sabbath had passed. Basically, as soon as they possibly could, they wanted to go and be with Jesus and do the things that they wanted to do. Another thing, in verse 1, it talks about that these women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, that these women showed up at the tomb. And this is fascinating because in the ancient world, women were not reliable witnesses. They wouldn't have been trusted. They couldn't testify in court. And so actually Mark and all the gospel writers highlighting the fact that the women were the ones at the tomb is a fascinating fact, because it gives us historical credibility that the gospel accounts about the resurrection. They wouldn't have made the story up. If you were going to make up a story about the resurrection, something that's really unbelievable to begin with, you would never pick women. You just never would pick women in the ancient world to be the witnesses, because they were not credible witnesses. So I don't know if you're following me on this, but basically it makes the story more historically reliable, because no one would have chosen to do this unless it was actually what happened. And then second, women are not secondary in Jesus's kingdom. They are the first to witness the resurrection, and they're really the first evangelists. In verse 1, it goes on and it talks about them that they're going to anoint Jesus. I know we don't really need to go into that, but these basically would have been spices that would have counteracted the odor that would have come from the body decomposing. Two more things, that there was a stone that was rolled away. It talks about that in verse 3. It actually just shows that the women were so eager to get to the tomb that they hadn't thought about how to roll it away. So it's a bit of an irony that they're just kind of didn't even think about that detail. And then the last bit that I'm going to highlight is a technical detail in verse 5, where it says, "And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed." It says young man, and it's a bit, who was this, some guy? Why is he in the tomb? What's going on? Is it a grave robber? What's going on? It's none of those things. The way that it's described there, when you connect it with other references, descriptions, obviously with the other gospel accounts, but also this idea that he's dressed in a white robe, we know that that was symbolic of a supernatural encounter, and we can see this back in Mark 9:3. We also see this right afterwards in Acts. There's plenty of verses in Daniel, lots of places, but Acts 1:10, Acts 10:30, this was certainly an angel. So even though it says a young man sitting dressed in a white robe, this is an angelic, supernatural being. All right, a couple illustrations, and then I'll be done. One would be the idea of using a clock. I thought of a clock kind of with a second hand that's ticking and going through. The idea of how Jesus died and he didn't fix things right away, and that for us, if we step into a relationship with Christ, that's usually not what happens. So, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, sometimes our life with Christ, it feels like it doesn't just take days, maybe 3 days. It might take 3 years. It might take 3 decades for God to do the things that we're hoping to see in our lives, and maybe not even within our lifetime. And so maybe just kind of the idea of timing, that there's something to that. When we come to Christ. Another one would be just really simple, like an analogy about when things change, when you come to faith in Christ, from death to life. This could be as simple as like a cardboard testimony. I'm sure you've seen it, but they'll come up and pick some folks to do a testimony and say one thing on one side about kind of their life before Christ, and then they flip it over something about their life with Christ. I do have one strong recommendation, which is on the, you have the old side, kind of what was going on previously, and then the new side. For the old side, have it be what it is. But for the new side, I'd strongly recommend that it's written in the present tense, in something that's still ongoing, not as if now everything's perfect, fixed, and finished in my life. So an example would be, maybe it's something kind of like, I was broken or I was hurt. And you might be tempted to say on the flip side, like, now I'm healed. You could do that, but I think it'd actually be more accurate to say I'm being healed, in the process of healing. Jesus is healing me, this kind of present and ongoing tense. I would just say, maybe, take a look at how those are written, maybe talk to those that are going to do that, and maybe explain to them about the reality of a lot of times things aren't totally fixed when you come to Christ, but God is involved with that process with you. Another one you could use, I've used this before, but a flashlight and a battery. So the idea of the source of life, and that when you get disconnected from the source of life, you can't do what you want, or maybe the batteries run out, whatever it is, that our lives, especially in Young Life or Wyldlife or what have you, Most of the people are young. They're not thinking that, the end of their life might be that far away. But life does slowly, seep out of us, and that our day will come. And I know that that's a pretty difficult topic to talk about, but it's one that we should bring up. And actually, I have one more, which is an analogy. You can just go get a tree branch or something. I actually happened to find this little flower. I think it's actually a weed. It's spring, popped up in my yard. But the idea that, this looks really lovely. There's little flowers on here, and you can see that all the, leaves are green. Here's the root system. Just say, look at this. This is great. And for all, practical purposes, it looks super healthy. And this is the way that humans look for the most part. Now, when you're old in the hospital, things are running out. We know that it starts to look, but the reality of our life with God and the reality of our spiritual life is He planted us. He created us. He designed us to be healthy and functioning. But because of our sin, we've been disconnected from the source. And through the cross, Jesus wants to reconnect us with Him. You could go to John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. You could pull that in. But in reality, this is what's happening with each one of us. Maybe we look healthy on the outside, but do you know what's going to happen to this little flower, this little branch, whatever it is, in the next week? Fast forward, what's going to happen? What's it going to look like? What's going to happen in the next month? If we were to just put this on a table and we came back in a year or 10 years, what would it look like? And sadly, or maybe importantly, we need to think about what our lives are like, disconnected from a right relationship with God. We can still go on. You still see a lot of life, a lot of beauty in life. Thank God for common grace. It gives us all really great things. But without having Christ in our life, the source of life, our lives are fundamentally changed, and it's already a reality. But we can reconnect with God. He can give us this new life. We can be born again, and we can be connected to the Creator of the universe now and forever. So that's just a couple ideas there. I hope some of these videos have been helpful. I'm excited to share with my friends at Pinnacle on Monday about the power of the resurrection that God's done in my life. For me, the key will be kind of opening up and sharing about some of those stories. And I hope that you can have some good talks too. Thanks for considering this. I hope that maybe a couple ideas came to mind, and that you have the best club talks you could possibly ever have as God opens your eyes to the scriptures. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye.